Greetings, I'm Yvonne Stapp for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to today's Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations program. Today's subject is the living soil and the importance of healthy soil for the environment and for stabilizing the climate. Our guest is Kristen DeAngelis, Associate Professor of Microbiology at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst. Dr. DeAngelis is an expert on the microbial systems that are the foundation of soil vitality. She's here to tell us about the complex nature of soil, its role in the health of the planet, and the need to protect soil. It's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Kristen DeAngelis. Thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And I would like to get started with some background, Dr. DeAngelis. Just could you tell us what soil is as opposed to just plain sterile dirt and that sort of thing?
Yeah, we can talk about that. So I'm not sure there's such a thing as sterile dirt. And I have this conversation with my students all the time. Soil, so what I was taught is that dirt is soil where it doesn't belong. And if you're wondering if something is soil, if a plant is growing in it, it's got all of the components of soil. Okay. So even a crack in the cement can sort of check all of the boxes if the plant is able to survive there. So generally, soil is composed of minerals, organic matter, microbes, water, and air.
Okay.
So those are the main components, and variations in the types and quantities of those things beget the variety of soils that you see in the world.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. So we'll look for some green stuff coming up. that is an important thing. But soil is actually very important, apparently, for the planet and for life in general. And there is where we seem to not have a lot of information, or not a lot of knowledge. Could you please give us an explanation of why that's so important for the planet and life?
Yeah, so soil is the foundation of our societies almost literally. And so without soil, I can't even finish a sentence like that. Soil is required for our food, our fiber, our fuel. And so it's really something that we need to survive. And in fact, I'm not sure we'd be here if there weren't soil. You mentioned that about soil conservation, and soil is a limiting natural resource. It is possible to grow soils because soil is microbial, and so growing soils encourages the growth of the microbes that are in soil. But it is a limiting natural resource because soils take centuries to form. It's very slow. And so soil conservation is quite important.
I see. So we wouldn't be here if we didn't have soil, because I guess we need oxygen, and that soil provides that for the plants, and so lets plant life survive and so on. So anyway, the thing about your work is that you really you're the expert on these microbial systems. And I want to underscore systems because that's one of the most interesting features about your work. Could you please tell us something about those ecosystems, those microbial systems?
Yeah, we do study soil as systems. And I like to think of soils as like a complex superorganism. The microbes all work together. They need each other. And these complex communities put together with the minerals and the other um, sort of environmental factors that emerge from the soil properties. These all work together to produce these emergent traits that we can't understand. So, something about the way soils are complex microbially and complex in their environmental factors makes soil properties that we can't quite predict. So, they are systems in that microbes work together in complex communities. And one interesting aspect is microbial diversity appears to be important, and the same is true for plant diversity, and these two are related. And we don't quite know if plant diversity sort of begets microbial diversity or if it happens the other way around because they're so interconnected. But more diverse communities tend to be more efficient, and they tend to be more resilient to stress.
Mm.
And so this is something that appears to be sort of true across the board for communities. And so one of the things we're trying to understand in our lab is the effects of this diversity and how we can encourage this kind of diversity.
I see. That is interesting that you bring up this diversity, a word we're hearing a lot now, and in exactly the way that you are describing it, that is a sustaining factor by itself. And that happens to be a big issue when you get to monocultures and a lot of big ag issues and things like that. Dr. DeAngelis, you work on these multiple systems, and you evidently have underscored the importance of scale variations in these ecosystems. I thought that was very interesting. Could you go into that a little bit from that lowest level to up? You mentioned the complexity.
Yeah. Yeah, scale is something that we think about a lot, and it's hard not to think about scale when you think about microbes. The definition of a microbe is any organism you need a microscope to see. So sometimes I joke that I'm just an ecologist. I can't see my study organism. And so, we need special tools to understand what's happening at these microscales, but also the rules are probably a little bit different at the microscale. So we do study microbes at this individual organismic scale. We look at their traits and their genomes to try and understand how they behave and come up with some better sort of guidelines for predicting how they'll behave. And then we've studied microbes at this sort of mesoscale, which is maybe the scale of like an individual plant interacting with its soil community. And then we've looked more at the ecosystem scale. I've worked in a number of different field sites in New England and California to try and understand sort of what is the aggregate effect of microbes on these ecosystem scales. And then we do a little bit of modeling to try and understand how to sort of export this information of what we think is true to regional and global scales. That's not the main effort of our lab, but we do enough so that we can sort of better inform models so that we can think about the global scale.
That's really interesting. So that scale matters then, right? There's the different levels there of these ecosystems. That's an important factor. I want to say that I have not encountered that before. I think we've done several programs on soil and certainly read a lot now, but I think that this seems very important that you've underscored this scale issue, and look forward to seeing more about that. But in the meantime, a part of the problem today is that there is so much danger for the protection for soil, that it's under threat. And so you see these articles about like the Great Plains areas where they were so rich, the topsoil was very rich and so on. And it has really been devastated. You have already pointed out earlier that it takes a long time to revive soil, and it takes a long time to build it up. So this is an important thing. Dr. DeAngelis, what are the main factors in the destruction of soil as we know it, the healthy soil?
Yeah, I mean, it's the main factors that present a danger to soil really vary regionally. And I was sort of on the sidelines involved with a Massachusetts state effort to define healthy soils and target sort of how we can better preserve soil. So we talked a little bit about soil importance for sort of human society, but you mentioned, and you are correct in mentioning, that soils store carbon and they're an important reservoir for carbon. Loss of carbon from the soil becomes a greenhouse gas. And of course, that's not the main reason why we're suffering from the effects of climate change. That's over-aggressive fossil fuel burning and emissions. But that incident warming, that is one of the symptoms of climate change, is being affected by our soils. So let me see. You asked me actually about
a couple of threats. I was thinking.
Oh yeah, what were the threats?
Yeah, the threats to soil, that it's been devastated very widely, apparently, for numerous reasons. But I was thinking about the effect of modern agriculture, especially monoculture, tilling, and so forth, and this whole issue of climate change, which is complex, as you're pointing out.
Yes, yeah. So monoculture agriculture is certainly not beneficial for soil, and a lot of the sort of modern practices of industrial agriculture do not focus on preserving or maintaining a healthy soil. And in fact, many of the services that soils provide to plants, aside from being a substrate, solid substrate for growth, nutrients and water availability, a lot of these very intensive monoculture agriculture practices provide those externally. But then the system is so inefficient that nitrogen cannot retain in the system and comes out through runoff and then causes eutrophication of our waters. And so, this modern agriculture is not great for soil. And a lot of new farming practices are really aimed at trying to reduce tilling or practice intercropping or having more mixed crop types to improve the plant diversity and maintain the soil structure. So this isn't something that we've talked about yet so far, but soil has a structure, and it has a structure at the microscale, which is, imagine that the habitat of an individual microbe. It lives in a small soil pore where there's a substrate around and water availability, and it's protected from predation. And then at the sort of plant scale, roots move through and can access those little pockets of nutrients, and they encourage microbial growth, and the microbes help to release nitrogen and phosphorus from the soil. And so in a natural system that is not tilled, sort of plants and microbes in that root, that portion of soil that's affected by the root, called the rhizosphere, is kind of like a handshake. They exchange carbon from the plants for nitrogen and phosphorus from the microbes. And it's something that each one needs from the other. It creates this sort of extensive underground network of a source of plant growth. So, we've understood for a long time. Well, let me back up. This kind of modern agriculture really sort of started in the 60s and 70s with this use of like modern irrigation, new pesticides, and synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, which now account for like humans are fixing through this synthetic nitrogen fertilizer as much nitrogen as all organisms naturally fix nitrogen. So it's this
Oh my
huge
goodness.
impact on the nitrogen cycle just from human societies. And tilling is also really destructive. And I don't know if you've ever, I show my students this PBS American Experience film called
Yes.
Surviving the Dust Bowl. And it was based on this book by the
Everybody should see it.
And everybody should see it. You're right. It's about an hour. And it was about sort of Americans waking up to needing to preserve soil. And it took a 10-year drought for people to really understand. I mean, these dust storms had to make it to Washington, D.C. from the Great Plains for people to really understand, like, this is an actual crisis of a natural resource that we need. And something that the film doesn't touch on, but I think is part of the crisis right now, is that the Native Americans had been farming this land for centuries before we got here and decided that we had a better way, which was this tilling monoculture agriculture. And so, I'm hoping that people will begin to appreciate traditional ecological knowledge and other ways of knowing how to know what people's role is in ecosystems, that we are not outside of ecosystems. We are part of the system, and it is possible with care to live within the system and to live more sustainably.
I really appreciate your bringing that up. We're seeing this sort of creep into the media gradually, that many of these earlier cultures had much more balanced systems. So they may not be perfect, but they didn't do the damage on the scale that you see from like the Dust Bowl, which was a kind of a horrifying thing. I want to ask a couple of things on that, particularly before we leave this monoculture thing. And that is that I think I understand that the use of pesticides in this in big ag has been brutal on the microbes because it kills off the microbes that are sustaining the soil. And the other one that you brought up with the nitrogen, I want to ask about. I've heard this referred to as making a drug addict out of the soil because it then craves this nitrogen fix, if you will. Would you tell us those two things? Is that true?
Sure. So first, pesticides. It's possible that pesticides are damaging microbial communities, but there's a vast reservoir of microbial diversity. We call it the long tail. And that means the more we investigate what kinds of microbes are there, the more we find. And at this moment, it seems almost limitless that it couldn't possibly be, I suppose. But there is so much microbial diversity, and there's a huge seed bank of microbes in the soil that are dormant or really low abundance, sort of waiting to grow. So if pesticides are causing a stress on microbes, removing the pesticides should make them come right back. And I'm more worried about bees and other pollinators from pesticide applications than microbes. Like, all of the stuff that we worry about, climate change and pollution, the microbes are going to be fine. The microbes are going to be just fine. So they come back. They will for sure come back. And then the other thing about the nitrogen, the synthetic fertilizers, they disrupt this natural handshake that the plants have with the soil communities. They make it so that the microbes aren't required. And so, while I tend to sort of revert to thinking about the bacterial communities in the soil, since that's more what we study, but it is possible that fungal communities would have to be sort of repopulated And I know, if you go to like a garden store, you can buy fungi. They're called mycorrhizae, and they'll help your plants grow. And so it is possible that the fungal communities would be knocked down to a point where they couldn't quite come back in that local region. And I don't know about fungal response to pesticides, but just by adding um, inorganic fertilizer, it reduces the need for plants to help the fungi grow and the bacteria grow that provide that nitrogen in an undisturbed system.
Ah, I see. Oh, this is great information. I really appreciate it. And then in terms of climate change, very briefly, that impact again, that the soil is very important in sort of sustaining the regular climate. It's an important factor, but this climate change, is having an impact on soil. Yes, that.
Yeah, yes. And so climate change is having an impact on soil, and the types of impacts are as varied as the soils themselves. So climate change is really this sort of um, big term, and there are a lot of symptoms of climate change. So warming, erosion, more frequent extreme storms. Catherine Hayhoe, who's a climate scientist, coined this term called global weirding, which is just a lot more sort of strange weather and more extreme weather, or weather that is unusual for a system. And so the threats to soil from climate change can come from drying, flooding, erosion from extreme storms. It's really, it's coming from all sides in a way. Yeah.
Wow, that's a lot. So you're very, your work is now increasingly important. You're doing work at a crucial time here. And so I'd like to turn to your research at this point. And can you tell us how you do the research? What's your particular focus and how you do that research?
Yeah. So the way that one of the things that we're working on in my lab is the effect of climate change on soils and soil microbes. And you're right. Coming up with this sort of plan was a direct response to my appreciating the severity of the climate crisis and the fact that this isn't going away, and that we need to understand it better. And so I have been working with colleagues at the Harvard Forest in Peterson, Massachusetts, on this long-term warming experiment. There are actually 3 at the Harvard Forest right now. And it's an experimental warming. So there are many, many warming experiments going on around the world. The way that we're warming our forest is through these buried heated resistance cables. So I don't know if you or any of your viewers have ever seen like a football game happening in the Midwest in winter, and there's like snow coming down and it's getting on everyone's hats, and the field is just still green somehow. And so this is the same technology. They're buried cables that are heating cables coupled to thermistors that are planted all throughout the plots that take the temperature of the heated plots and the temperature of the control, and they feed back to a computer that puts current through these cables to raise the temperature of the heated plots 5 degrees above ambient temperature. And so this sort of information feedback loop is going on every 5 minutes, and it's been going on since 1991.
Wow.
Yep. So we just hit 30 years of soil warming. And at the time, 5 degrees was decided upon because it was one of the more extreme scenarios of global warming. It's looking less like an outside possibility, unfortunately, but really 5 degrees would be devastating. I think we're at 1 degree right now for global temperatures. and it would be truly devastating. But the idea was to sort of create an extreme type of environment to try and understand how the soils and soil systems would respond to long-term warming.
Right. So interesting. Now you said, well, microbes will eventually come back, with everything. But does this underscore this temperature crisis that you've experimented with? Does that underscore that it makes it a longer time before that it can revive?
So I'll answer your question in two ways. So one is that occasionally to do maintenance on these experimental plots, we have to turn the temperature off. We have to turn the experiment off to replace parts or something like that.
Yeah.
And we did this last year. It was a year and a half ago. So it was before the pandemic. We had to turn it off for a few weeks, and we were sort of taking bets to see how quickly the respiration would return to normal, sort of how quickly the plots would appear to return to normal when they weren't being heated anymore. And what we found was that they actually never quite came back in terms of activity. And that's partly because this accelerated warming has caused so much carbon loss that the organic matter in the soil is partly what makes it healthy. And so like a blacker soil is a really healthy soil, and some of that organic matter is lost. And that organic matter helps soils to be spongy for water. And we think that because they are not able to retain as much water, they've lost a bit of buffering capacity for temperature. And so that was an unexpected change. So that loss of organic matter really is a quantitative measure of the decline of soil quality. The other thing that we're discovering in our lab now is that 30 years of warming is enough of a stress to exert a selective pressure on microbes. In other words, the microbes are evolving to these new conditions. And this microbial evolution is an irreversible change in microbes. And it's not a change in the types of microbes that are there, but it's a change in the traits of individual microbes. And so it's things like the microbes exposed to long-term warming are better able to degrade complex carbon. And that's the carbon that's stored in the soil. And we want this carbon to stay in the soil, but the microbes have become better at accessing that carbon because the heat is causing them to want to grow faster. They also are more resilient to drought because the soils are a little drier, being warmed for so long. And we're testing some other traits as well. So those two effects are something that we're seeing.
Wow, that's most interesting, isn't it? That sounds like they are quite adaptive. That is, they can quickly adapt to some things, some factors, maybe not so to others, but that is really a lot of insight. And I didn't realize this work had gone on for some 30 years. So you really caught it at the crisis point, as it's building and building. Dr. DeAngelis, what would you say are the things that have been most significant in your findings for you?
Well, I just want to preface by saying I have not been working in the warming experiments for 30 years.
No, I understand.
I've had the privilege of working there for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And so what's the most significant, our most significant finding? So two things have surprised me recently, or not surprised me, but I think are important. One is we're starting to better understand that there are different types of carbon in soil, and some new research from a former postdoc in our group, Luis Dominguez Horta, and a graduate student, Melissa Shinfuku, have found that more diverse microbial communities not only make more soil carbon, but it is in a more stable form. So this is a really important insight because I think it speaks to the idea that management practices that encourage microbial diversity make more carbon that's in these slow turning over pools that will stay stored in soils and make them healthy for a long time. Um, and then, I talked a little bit already about the microbial evolution, and this has been really remarkable to me. And this is something that we're working on now, is to try and understand the genetic basis of this
Mhm.
apparent microbial adaptation to warming.
That I would like to say, I haven't seen much on that at all. So I think that we'll look forward to hearing more from you on that. But you're
Yeah.
doing all of this at a really good moment in a lot of ways. You have apparently good technology for pursuing this kind of research, and a time in back that there's enough data in before leading up to now that it can be very helpful. Before we leave, Dr. DeAngelis, what is your general prognosis for the state of the soil in general?
Well, I'm seeing more people feeling willing to be aware of soil as an important natural resource. And so I'm hopeful. Something that has been a bit of a side effect of the pandemic is people have been going back to gardening again
Yes.
and tending their yards. And so I just hope that this trend continues, that people appreciate that the soil that they have stewardship over, and it could just be, their yard or the bioswales around their apartment building, that those are important. Those are important resources, and that people feel some ownership over those.
Yeah.
So it sounds goofy, but plant a tree. It really does help. It helps the soil. Yeah.
Right. I really appreciate that. This is wonderful information. And I wish you all the best in your work. And I look forward to following it more. And before we leave, I just want to say that for viewers, we'll put a post up on this video that Dr. DeAngelis was part of a team that wrote a piece in the online magazine, The Conversation, that is also very interesting. So I'd like for people to be able to access that as well. Dr. DeAngelis, thank you ever so much for this very excellent information.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure talking with you.